The snow came down in wide, silent veils, swallowing the little station and its creaking boards, until it looked less like a place for travelers, and more like a forsaken altar at the end of the world. Evelyn Grace stood on the platform, her shawl thin and trembling against the bitter wind, eyes lowered to the tracks as if they might split open and swallow her whole. Her breath came in ragged wisps of frost, her lips cracked, her hands raw. When a man brushed too close with the excuse of helping her down, she pulled back and whispered, almost to herself, "Don't touch me. I'm broken." The words shivered from her mouth like glass splintering on stone. She did not mean for anyone to hear, but the snow carried sound strangely, and those nearby turned to look. A few faces softened, but most hardened, judgment quick as the cold. Someone muttered about shame, about mistakes that follow a girl forever. Evelyn Mayfield's eyes, sharp as hatpins beneath her fur bonnet, swept Evelyn with a kind of satisfied cruelty, as though her misery was confirmation of gossip. Evelyn clutched her shawl tighter, shrinking, wishing she could vanish into the storm. Then, from the far end of the platform, the crowd stilled as a figure emerged from the white blur. A giant of a man, bare-chested beneath the snowfall, his hair white as the storm itself, his skin coppered and weathered like the earth under summer sun. White Hawk! The sight of him was enough to send a ripple of unease through the townsfolk. He said nothing, made no gesture of greeting. His silence was heavier than any voice. He moved toward her with long, deliberate strides, boots pressing deep into the frost-bitten wood. Evelyn lifted her face and saw him through the curtain of snow. Those dark, steady eyes that did not flinch, did not leer, did not pity. He simply stood before her, a tower of stillness, the snow melting into beads along the lines of his shoulders, his breath rising like smoke from a great fire within. For a moment she thought he would speak, that he might name her shame aloud as others had. But he only extended a hand, not reaching for her, not touching, simply holding it there, palm open, as though the choice were hers. The crowd whispered, restless, sharp voices rising about propriety, about Indians, about danger. The sheriff, Amos Cutter, shifted his hat lower, watching, but did not step forward. Evelyn Mayfield's lips curled. Evelyn's pulse thundered. Her body wanted to recoil, but her heart, that bruised and weary heart, hesitated. Cold gnawed through her bones. Her legs trembled with hunger and exhaustion. She did not take his hand, but neither did she step back. And in that pause, White Hawk made his decision. Without a word he bent, lifted her as though she weighed no more than a child, and turned away from the station. Gasps broke the hush. "He's taking her!" Someone cried. "Savage!" Another spat. Yet no one followed. Perhaps it was his size, or the cold iron of his silence. Perhaps the storm itself had chosen sides. Whatever it was, the crowd parted, and he carried her through the veil of snow without a single voice rising to stop him. Evelyn pressed her face against his shoulder, not from trust, but to shield herself from the cutting wind and the sharper eyes. His skin radiated heat despite the storm, a steady warmth that startled her, that seemed impossible. Each step he took sounded like final judgment, boots crunching into eternity. She shut her eyes, whispering again, though now only the storm heard. "I'm broken." He did not answer. His silence was answer enough. The journey blurred into whiteness. She felt his chest rise and fall beneath her cheek, felt the rhythm of his steps, steady as a drumbeat. No questions, no accusations, no words at all. Just the storm, and the strength that bore her through it. Her shame twisted inside her like a living thing, hissing that she should not let him carry her, that she should resist, run, vanish. Yet her limbs clung despite themselves, weak, defeated by hunger and cold. When at last the shape of a cabin appeared, huddled against the dark line of trees, Evelyn thought perhaps she had been delivered to some final place, a punishment or a mercy. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, fragile line. White Hawk shouldered the door open and carried her inside, where the scent of pine resin and smoke clung to the rafters. He set her down near the fire, not close enough to startle, but where the heat would reach her. She sank into the bearskin rug, limbs useless, eyes darting, waiting for what would follow. But he did not loom over her. He moved instead to the hearth, feeding the fire, coaxing it with patient hands until it burned brighter. The light threw shadows against the log walls, gilding the furrows of his shoulders, painting his white hair with flickers of gold. He glanced at her once, only once, as if to confirm she had not collapsed entirely, then returned to the fire. Evelyn sat trembling, fingers twisting in her shawl. No man had ever touched her without taking, without demand, without consequence. His silence was disarming, his restraint unbearable. She wanted to weep but found no tears left. The storm howled outside, rattling the shutters, but within the cabin was a strange, unbroken stillness. Her heart pounded with questions she could not voice. Why had he taken her? What did he want? Did he see her shame as clearly as the others had? The fire cracked, sparks leaping, as if mocking her silence. White Hawk rose, crossed to the table, and laid a folded blanket near her feet. Again, not offering it into her hands, not bridging the space between them, but placing it within her reach. Then he returned to the far side of the cabin, lowered himself onto a stool, and sat with the weight of stone, eyes fixed on the flames. Evelyn drew the blanket around her, the coarse wool scratching but warm. For the first time in days, perhaps weeks, her shivering eased. Her body began to remember safety, though her heart still thrashed. She dared one glance at him. His profile caught the firelight, stern and unreadable, like something carved into the side of a canyon. He neither sought her gaze nor avoided it. The storm thickened outside, snow piling against the door. The cabin groaned under the wind. Evelyn leaned her head against the log wall, exhaustion dragging her down. The fire popped, and in that moment between wakefulness and sleep, she thought she saw his hand twitch, as if he meant to reach toward her, then stilled himself again. Her eyes closed, yet her mind whispered. He had taken her from the eyes of the town, from the cruel mouths and pointing fingers. He had said nothing, done nothing but carry her here. Silence might be a prison, or it might be a shield. She could not yet know. The last thing she heard before sleep claimed her was the wind clawing at the walls, and the steady, unbroken sound of him breathing across the fire, as if the storm outside could rage forever, and he would still be there immovable. And in the quiet of her drifting mind, the fear that he might leave her warred with the fear that he never would. Morning came slow, pressed thin through the cracks in the cabin logs, a gray light softened by snowfall that had not stopped since the night before. Evelyn stirred beneath the coarse blanket, the fire burned low but steady, and across the room White Hawk sat as he had sat all through the storm, silent, watchful, hands resting on his knees as though carved from the same wood that held the roof above them. For a moment she thought she had dreamed him, that her mind, fevered with cold, had conjured a guardian to carry her from the jeering crowd. But the ache in her arms where he had lifted her, the faint trace of pine resin in her hair, told her he was no dream. When she shifted, he rose without a sound and added wood to the fire. Sparks climbed like startled birds. He left a tin cup of water by her side, then returned to his place. No questions, no commands. The silence between them stretched long, thick as the winter air, yet it held no malice. Still, shame whispered louder than the fire. She sipped the water, every swallow cutting her dry throat, and remembered the eyes at the station, the voices that had branded her broken. Those voices had followed her here. They lived in her chest, a wound that would not close. By midday the storm eased, light pushing harder against the windows, and White Hawk opened the door. Cold flooded in, biting, but it carried with it the smell of pine and the far cry of crows. He beckoned with a tilt of his head, not a word. She hesitated, but her body longed for air, for something beyond the walls of her thoughts. So she followed him into the snow, boots sinking to the ankles. The world outside was hushed white, branches heavy with frost, the path from the cabin nearly erased. He handed her a bundle of wood to carry, not heavy, not beyond her strength, as if he knew exactly what she could bear. They walked together to the lean-to, where logs were stacked beneath a sagging roof. Her breath smoked, her fingers burned with cold, but the work steadied her trembling. He said nothing. His silence was not absence but presence, and though she did not yet understand it, it worked against the echo of those voices that had haunted her. Still, whispers crept. In the town below, Evelyn Mayfield and Sheriff Amos Cutter stirred the embers of gossip. By the stove at the general store, tongues wagged about the girl who had run herself into ruin, and the Indian who carried her off into the snow. Some called it abduction, others muttered darker things. No one imagined she might have chosen the shelter of his silence. No one wanted to believe she could be safer there than in their company. The West thrived on judgment as much as it did on survival, and Evelyn's name slid from mouth to mouth like a coin passed in secret. Back in the cabin, she felt the weight of that unseen judgment pressing still, though he never spoke of it. She watched him mend his tools, the slow patient care of his hands, and wondered if he heard those rumors too. Perhaps he had always lived with them, a man marked by the color of his skin, the echo of a tribe driven to the edges of the land. Perhaps he carried wounds that did not bleed. She caught herself studying him by firelight, tracing the deep lines of his face, the silver fall of his hair. He noticed, though he did not turn his head, and for the first time she felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with shame. Days blurred. Snow, fire, silence. She began to sweep the cabin, to fold the blankets neatly, to wash her hands in melted snow until they were raw but clean. He never asked it of her, never corrected her, but his eyes softened at the order she made from the small things. When she burned her palm against the kettle, he crossed the room swift as thunder and dipped her hand in cool water. She flinched from his touch, but he withdrew before she could recoil fully, leaving her startled by the absence of demand. She wrapped the hand in cloth, and when she caught his gaze again, she saw no triumph there, only quiet concern. At night she sometimes woke to find him seated near the door, as if standing guard against more than the storm. She wondered if he feared the town would come for her, or if he simply feared the wolves that sometimes howled from the ridges. Once, she dreamed of Evelyn's sharp voice calling her ruined, and when she woke with a cry, White Hawk lifted a lantern so its light calmed the corners of the room. He did not move closer, did not ask, only let the light burn until her breathing steadied. The days pressed forward, winter holding them in its fist. The whispers in town thickened, riding the wind even into her thoughts. She had been taken, they said. She had been defiled, they said. But in the cabin, no hand touched her, no word cut her. The only wound was the one she carried herself, and against that wound his silence began to work like balm. Yet the more she leaned on that quiet, the more she feared its loss. One afternoon, after fetching water from the frozen creek, she paused at the threshold of the cabin. He was inside, kneeling by the hearth, coaxing the fire. Something in the stillness of that moment, his back bent toward the flame, the snow tumbling beyond the window, struck her with a sudden ache. She whispered aloud, not knowing why, "Why are you kind?" The words froze in the air, fragile as ice. He did not answer. He only glanced at her once, long enough for her to see that the question itself had wounded him. She drew back, ashamed of speaking at all. That night, when the storm clawed again at the walls, she lay awake staring at the ceiling beams. Her shame pressed harder than the cold, whispering that she did not belong here, that her presence endangered him. Perhaps the town would come, with torches and rifles, demanding her return to a place she could not go. Perhaps they would burn this cabin down for harboring her. She turned on her side, clutching the blanket tight. Across the fire, White Hawk sat, his profile etched in flame, unyielding as stone. For the first time, she realized he might not simply be shielding her. He might be daring the whole world to come. And with that thought came fear sharper than any she had yet known. Not fear of him, not fear of the town, but fear of what it would mean if he never let her go. The storm had no memory of mercy. Day after day, it pressed against the cabin walls with a ceaseless hand, piling snow against the door, until White Hawk had to shoulder it open with the weight of his body. The forest beyond seemed to shrink into whiteness, trees reduced to shadows, the world to a narrow circle of survival. Inside, the fire became their only horizon, and in its glow a fragile rhythm formed between them, one of gestures, glances, and silence that hummed louder than words. Evelyn began to move about the space without asking, sweeping the corners, mending seams with thread she found in a tin, arranging the kettle so steam carried warmth into the rafters. He let her, never correcting, never instructing. She caught him once watching her hands stitch a torn sleeve. His eyes lowered not to her face, but to the patient movement of the needle. Something in his gaze unsettled her. Not desire, not pity, but recognition, as if he saw in her effort the echo of his own scars. She felt her throat tighten, the burn of unshed tears, and bent her head lower over the fabric until her vision blurred. At dusk, when the snow turned the windows to pale stone, he returned from checking the horses with his coat heavy with frost. She reached for the sleeve before she could stop herself, brushing the ice from the edge. Her fingers stilled, the gesture too bold, and she pulled back quickly, shame filling her chest. He made no move to hold her hand, yet he did not step away. He let the ice melt on his shoulders, drops pattering onto the floor like clock ticks. The air between them grew charged, and when he finally moved, it was only to place another log on the fire. Still, something had shifted, a thread drawn taut. At night, the silence deepened until she could hear her own heart louder than the storm. She sat by the fire, staring into its restless dance, and found her voice breaking free against her will. "I used to think a fire meant safety," she murmured, not looking at him. "A hearth, a home." But then voices filled the rooms. Voices can cut deeper than knives. She pressed her fingers hard into her palm, leaving half-moon marks. "They called me ruined. They called me less than nothing. And I believed them. I still believe them." Her voice fell into the hush, trembling and raw. She had not meant to confess it aloud, but the fire had coaxed it out like sap from a wounded tree. When she dared a glance across the flames, she found his eyes steady on her, dark and fathomless, reflecting both flame and sorrow. He did not offer comfort, did not drown her words in contradiction. His silence was not emptiness but a vessel, and in it her confession settled like a stone in still water. He leaned forward then, taking a coal stick from the hearth and etching a mark on the log wall. A small gesture, cryptic but deliberate. She frowned, uncertain. "Why do you do that?" she whispered. He lifted the charred stick, touched it once to his chest, then to the wall again, and placed it back by the fire. The mark was not for her to understand, not yet, but she felt the weight of it. A keeping. A remembering. The days that followed wove them closer in quiet ways. She began to speak more, halting words about her mother's hands, her father's absence, the betrayal that left her hollow. Each time, she braced for judgment, but it never came. He answered in silence, in the set of his shoulders, the patience of his work. One night, as she sewed a tear in his old coat, she said softly, "I am not worth the burden of mending." He took the coat from her hands, shrugged into it, and stood tall before the fire, the stitches gleaming faint in the light. Then he placed the coat back around her shoulders, the weight of it drawing tears she could not stop. Outside, wolves began to circle closer, their cries a knife through the night. She startled, clutching the coat tight, but he rose with his axe and stood at the door until the howls moved further into the hills. He returned and scathed and sat once more across from her, his chest rising calm as though nothing had stirred. She saw then how he had lived all his years, bearing storms, bearing wolves, bearing judgment, and a trembling respect rooted itself in her heart. One evening, Jedediah Boone rode near the cabin on his way to traplines, his silhouette visible against the drifts. He paused, peered through the swirling snow, and saw Evelyn carrying wood to the pile while White Hawk split logs with steady rhythm. Jedediah tipped his hat, eyes weary with knowing, and rode on. Later, by the stove in town, he would mutter that sometimes two broken branches, leaned against each other, can stand taller than a tree left alone. The words would be swallowed by gossip, but Evelyn would feel their truth long before she heard them. That night, she lingered by the fire longer than usual. Shadows swayed across the walls, her hair catching the glow in loose strands. She drew a breath that tasted of ash and pine. "I am afraid," she whispered. Her voice cracked. "Afraid that the town will come. Afraid that you will send me away. Afraid that if I stay, I will be found unworthy even here." Her honesty hung heavy. She had bared herself like a wound reopened. Across the fire, his eyes met hers with a steadiness that shook her. He did not cross the room, did not take her hand, but he let the silence stretch long enough that she felt her pulse in every vein. At last he touched his chest once with his palm, then spread his hand outward toward her. Not a command, not a claim, but a vow that needed no words. Her breath shuddered out of her, and she turned her face away, overwhelmed. The snow beat harder against the cabin.